Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to CBI at 10. My name is Liz Mosley. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise Media, and we partner with the CBI to bring you these sessions a couple of times a week. This morning, we're going to have a go at Brexit, or rather where we are with Brexit, the transition, the future trading relationship, and how everybody is coping kind of a month and a bit in to this new trading and living and working relationship that we have with the European Union. As we always do, we will start though with Matthew Fell, Chief UK Policy Director of the CBI, who's going to just do a quick touch base on the sort of latest COVID related developments from the past 7 days before we go to our expert panel and dig in to the Brexit situation. So good morning, Matthew. I'm pleased that you're wearing your crown for us this morning. That seems absolutely appropriate. Last week we've kind of had, there's been some good news this morning about infectiousness and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and then some sort of less good news about variants and things. What do you think the most important things are on the COVID front from the last 7 days?
Yeah, well, thanks, Liz, and good morning, everyone. As you say, I'll be very brief, but the real focus for this week for us, as we talked about on Monday on the webinar with Tony Danker, is working on a roadmap for reopening in parallel with all of those efforts that are going on with the vaccines, testing to get on top of the virus and so on. What we're really keen to do is be clear this is a sort of date neutral effort, but getting extra detail that's going to be helpful for companies to plan their own reopening efforts and their own horizon scanning. So we're getting in lots of insights from business that we can offer up to government to help inform their own planning and their thoughts. We've written to Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary. That's been well received. We're after information about helping companies understand, what's thought about as low, medium and high risk activity, so they can plan their own sequencing of activities, helping them to understand the kind of conditions that are going to need to be met for reopening, and also what would doing regular mass testing in the workplace, what might that enable them to do more of than they could do without that testing taking place. What we're really turning our attention to this week is gathering insights from business, and it'd be great if people on the call can help us in these efforts. We're after as much practical, operational, granular detail as we can possibly get. So understanding from companies, what will be the top things that they'd really like extra clarity on? What are their own working assumptions for when they're going to be back up to full capacity? And what are the sort of optimal lead times that they'd like in terms of getting notice between here's the plan and this is when we're going to be back open and so on. And that will differ sector by sector. We had a really good session yesterday with some of the CBI's trade association members, getting good insights. So for retail, for example, they said, given the choice, they'd be back open tomorrow, but ideally they'd like up to a sort of couple of weeks notice period. The automotive sector, understanding that for them, a new car registrations March is a critical time for showrooms, for example. And in recruitment, they were saying if we could get a really good heads up on the sequencing of different parts of the economy opening up, we could gear up our own efforts to be prioritizing those sectors that are going to be first out the traps, helping with any training and induction, particularly for temporary staff that might be coming on stream and so on. So the more people can share those insights with us, so much the better. Beyond that, Liz, as you said, plenty going on with vaccines and testing. We're now past 10 million vaccine jabs rolled out in the UK. Over 500,000 of those are now onto the second doses, and also with workplace testing guidance available to businesses on the up all the time. So do keep an eye out for that. So that's the COVID and the COVID update. We're also, let me just give a quick plug, got an eye to the long term of the economy as well. And if people have got time later on today, Tony Danker, our Director General, setting out a really important speech hosted by Bloomberg for us, setting out an economic vision for the UK at 2 o'clock. And again, look out for details of that in the chat if people are interested in catching up with that.
Great, thank you, Matthew. I guess if people would like to provide the information and the sort of insights that you've asked for there, it would be great. Alice has just posted in the chat the sort of best means to get that stuff into. So that's the COVID bit. And now if we move our attention to the Brexit bit, where are the CBI sort of headed? What are the key headlines or messages from a CBI perspective on the end of the transition?
Yeah, well, Thanks, Liz. I mean, I maybe just first start by sort of recapping almost on the sentiment at the turn of the year when we did the analysis and then the deal was announced. And I think first off, the sentiment was relief, actually. We've avoided a no deal scenario and actually got some real positives in there around zero tariffs, zero quotas, the grace periods, for example, on rules of origin paperwork and so on. All of those incredibly helpful for business. But also, I think, a realization there are some gaps in here, it's pretty thin on services and so on, and a recognition that it's going to fundamentally change the trading relationship. So from here on in, I think our approach is very much thinking around a sort of short, medium and long-term kind of setup. So in the immediate term, working with all the businesses on the call, our members, to keep borders open, trade flowing and so on. And inevitably, as we know, trade volumes are increasingly ramping up since the turn of the year. We're identifying new issues, some of those that we perhaps knew would be an issue and we can now resolve those, some of those new issues popping up. So do keep those feeding into the CBI. We're working incredibly closely with Jess and all her colleagues at the Cabinet Office. Michael Gove is chairing a weekly session with the CBI and other business organisations so we can get onto those issues as they arise and resolve them as quickly as possible. Secondly, and this is the medium-term piece, looking to identify how and where we can build on the deal, particularly as those grace periods expire. And we're looking at areas like financial services, data adequacy, professional qualifications, and so on. And then thirdly and finally, into the long term, having an eye to opportunities as well. I mentioned Tony is setting out our thoughts around an economic vision later on today. Let's really use that as a starting point and then think, how do we over time craft UK regulation, trade deals, everything that flows from that, using that economic vision of a guiding light so we line up as best we can behind the UK's competitive advantages. So that's how we're thinking about things, Liz. Back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Matthew. So just a reminder to the people that have joined us this morning, if you would like to ask a question to our experts this morning, then you absolutely can do that. Just use the questions function in the webinar. If you want to ask it anonymously, that's fine too. Just put anon and post it, and then I'll sort of filter with help of CBI colleagues behind the scenes so we can bring to the table what you're asking too. I'm going to come now to Jess Glover, if I can. Thank you very much, Jess, for making the time this morning. I imagine it's not a quiet time for you at the moment, so appreciate you being here. Jess is DG for transition at the Cabinet Office. I'd love to hear a bit of an update on some of the sort of outstanding issues, if you like, the things that haven't quite been resolved yet from the original transition agreement. We know financial services equivalence and data are two of the key ones. Just would you give us a bit of an update on where we are with those sort of bricks in the wall, if you like, that are yet to slot into place?
Certainly, Liz, and thank you very much to you and CBI colleagues for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk to you. I mean, if I may just step back for a moment and just to do a few kind of headline points. So I was here on the 21st of October and really enjoyed that session too. And as Matthew says, a few things have changed quite a lot since then. We now know where we are. We now know where we stand, and we previously didn't know that. So we have a deal agreed on Christmas Eve. And while we said quite a lot of last year that quite a lot of what was going to be happening in 2021 was common to either scenario, deal or no deal, I think we all agree, can all agree very, very easily that being in a scenario where we have a deal is much better. And of course, it gives everybody the certainty of what the new relationship with the EU now is and now means. So we're in a new phase where we know what we've got to do, and it's a question of getting on and getting used to it and doing it. Having said that, we're only a month in, and also there is a little bit more to do, which I'll come on to in a moment, and financial services and data, as you say, Liz, are a couple of those. One of the questions I think that was asked in advance was, what are the main challenges facing businesses at the moment? And I think the fact that we're only a month in is a really important fact, because it's still very early in getting used to what is which is a hugely significant change in the way that we operate with the EU. And so quite naturally, the early challenges that businesses have faced have focused on issues relating to moving goods in and out of the EU, specifically new customs and border processes, rules of origin, and SPS requirements. And those are all things that we collectively need to work really hard on together to work through how it works, to make sure that government is giving you the best possible guidance to figure out what the new systems and processes mean. And that is a massively collaborative effort at the moment between government and business. I'm very, very grateful to the business organisations and of course the CBI for the way that we're working together at the moment, which is to really assemble what are the biggest issues and where is it a matter of making sure that government guidance is as clear as possible, that departments are doing a good a job as possible with their sectors in helping them walk through all of that. And where are there sort of structural changes that we just need to acknowledge and now get used to? So that collaborative effort is really important, and we've got quite a lot going on to support government, to support businesses. We've got direct engagement, we've got the Brexit checker on gov.uk, which I would encourage anyone who hasn't signed up to do. We've got about 30 government call centres on various different issues. We've got an SME helpline. Some of our services have a 24-hour service, for example, on customs and DEFRA, fish exports. And as a result of the Brexit Business Task Force, we've also set off various offshoot task forces at official level, one on Northern Ireland, for example, one on, we're going to be setting up one on sort of Scotland and seafood and so on. So I hope you can see that there is a real massive effort going on. I know there's a lot to get used to, and I know there's a lot to kind of adjust to, and we don't underestimate the significance of that for business, and really want that partnership effort to help. I mentioned that there was more to do, and I think partly because of the COVID effect, which, you know, is as Matthew was just saying, the whole area, separate area of challenge, which is very interlinked and that you're having to deal with simultaneously. There has been much less travel, of course, than there would be in normal times, and far more operating like this remotely, which means I think that some of those travel implications have not yet been felt. So at the happy moment when travel restrictions are lifted, I think we will also see people getting used to, citizens just getting used to things like needing 6 months left on your passport and so on. We need an effort to make sure people are ready for that. But that, of course, also goes for people travelling for business purposes and to provide services in the EU 27 member states. And we know that there are different rules in different member states, and we know that that's going to be hard to navigate. And I and my team are working with BEIS and DCMS and others to make sure that the guidance we can provide is as clear as possible, so you don't have to kind of learn however many different languages and, you know, have tabs on however many different websites to work out what the rules really are, accepting that in the end the authority on how to do X in Germany is you know, are the Germans, not us.
Yeah.
On the more to do front, you mentioned data and you mentioned financial services, Liz. On data adequacy, as you will all very well know, we did not secure data adequacy ahead of the 31st of December, but we did agree a bridging agreement with the EU to continue the status quo for 6 months, during which period we fully anticipate securing data adequacy, because, you know, as everybody knows, we're currently fully running GDPR, so, you know, we are data adequate, right? Anyway, that's a process that is ongoing, and I hope that we will have good news soon. On financial services, so what we have done with the EU there is agree a joint declaration on regulatory cooperation, which sets out our intention to discuss shared challenges. And it's going to be really important there too, that we have a good conversation with the financial services sector across the UK and across the EU indeed, to make sure that the sorts of things that the EU and the UK should be discussing in that regard are being discussed and addressed. On the more to do front, one of the things we did, of course, was to delay the introduction of import controls. Those are coming, and I know that many people will sort of want to not be thinking about that now, because they'll be thinking about adjusting to the arrangements have just come into place. But we will need to make sure that people who import are ready for the paperwork from April, and then the full import controls from July. And indeed, we need to make sure that the government's ready for that too, right, with the systems and the infrastructure and the people in place to do that. So that's one, I think, not to forget about. On Northern Ireland, I mean, there's been an awful lot of coverage on this in the media over the weekend, and there is an awful lot of focus now on making sure that the various grace periods associated with the Northern Ireland Protocol, that we put those on a permanent, sustainable footing. You'll have seen that Michael Gove has written to Maroš Šefčovič, and that is an intense area of activity right now to get certainty for businesses as early as possible as to what those arrangements are going to be, with good collaboration and cooperation with the Irish as well, because of course, you know, they share our interest in making sure that those arrangements are as smooth as possible. Matthew mentioned sort of the opportunities side of things. I mean, I know that right now you might not be jumping up and down with excitement about the opportunities because you're still working out what customs forms you need, but, you know, that will come, and the government launched today its consultation on the subsidy new subsidy control regime, and I'd encourage you to look at that and respond to that. Matthew mentioned regulations. Now, I know that what you want and need for the time being is certainty that nothing will change for the time being while you get used to everything, and that is the case, but we will be starting to turn our minds to future possible beneficial changes to regulation as a result of having left the EU. So, you know, somewhere in the back of your mind, you might want to be turning that over too, and I know that the CBI and others will be really interested in being part of that conversation. I think very practically making sure that we are really helping businesses export and understand how to export, not just to the EU, but also to the rest of the world. And I think there is a sort of a possibility there that a business who wants to export might be able to, once it's understood what it needs to do for the EU, might be able then be in a better position to look to wider markets too. And that's something that DIT, I know, wants to help exporting businesses with, and it's a big focus of the Prime Minister. And the last thing I just wanted to mention was you'll have seen the announcement of David Frost's appointment on Friday. He is going to be the Prime Minister's representative for Brexit and international policy, and will continue to play, therefore, a strong role in what we do about Brexit now we've done it, if you see what I mean. So I think that there's still, you know, there's plenty to do, as Matthew says, in the very short term, which is to sort of work in partnership to make sure the guidance and support is as effective as possible. And then there's more to do in the longer term about how to make the most of the situation we are now in. I think that one last thing I wanted to mention was, I know I hear questions quite a lot about whether or not the deal is going to be improved. You know, are we going back to the negotiation table to secure more access on X, Y, or Z? I mean, I think the very blunt answer to that for now is no. And I think in some ways that's good, because it's certainty. You know, this is the situation will continue. There are certain areas, the ones I've mentioned, data and financial services, where we've got other mechanisms for progress. There are other areas which are actually within the purview of individual national member state competence, where we might be able to secure market openings and easements, which are done on a sort of bilateral level, and that's something that we're going to be looking at. And there are other areas where they are autonomous decisions for the EU, i.e. decisions for the EU to make alone. It's not part of, it wouldn't be part of reopening the TCA, and the eel and bivalve mollusks thing is an example of that. So there are areas where we want to improve access to the EU, but I would be quite surprised if we on either side thought that the right way to approach that was to reopen elements of the TCA right now. I'll stop there because I'm sure there are plenty of other questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jess. There's a lot in there, and always good to have a webinar about bivalve mollusks, I think, on a Wednesday morning. That helps us all set off on the right foot. There's just a really simple thing. Obviously, businesses do a bazillion different things, and just before we started the webinar, there was a really handy, I think, simple sort of checklist of places that people could go if you're struggling for the specific answers to your particular business with your unique circumstances, particularly around rules of origin. You sort of mentioned there is sort of a three-step process people can go to find out the answers to those questions, and the first one was gov.uk, do the Brexit checker. There's a lot on there. The second one, I think, was HMRC, if you can't quite get the answer to your question. And then the third, if you're still struggling after HMRC, what do people do then?
So I think, as you say, Liz, the first thing to do is get onto gov.uk, find the guidance there, and register yourself for an account. Now, if you find the guidance and you find that it's not good enough and it's not telling you what you need, please tell the CBI or whatever business organisation you're most closely associated with, because they are constantly giving that feedback. You know, this guidance is, you know, you think it's actionable, but it's not. You know, we're doing that iterative process all the time, and part of the role of me and my team in the Cabinet Office is to sort of, you know, work with departments to make sure their guidance is as clear as possible. So that's thing one. If it's a customs issue, and so borders, rules of origin and so on, then HMRC is your best bet. And as I say, they have 24-hour helplines, so do get on to those. Otherwise, I think if you're a large business operating in a particular sector, I would hope and expect that you have good relationships with the relevant government departments. So, for example, if you're a large food or agriculture business, I would expect that you have a relationship with DEFRA. Again, if you think you should be in that category but don't have that kind of relationship, then please, again, sort of feed that back via the business organisations to me and my team. And then I think for SMEs, There is an SME helpline. Now that helpline won't tell you all the answers because it's not expert enough to do it, but it will tell you where to go to find the answers. It's a helpline where you can book an hour-long consultation with an advisor to find out what you need to know, and then you can book a follow-up consultation too if you need to. So we're going to be doing a bit of work next week to make sure that the existence of that helpline for SMEs is well known and well understood, and that service is kind of known to be out there. But that's the advice I would give.
That's really, really helpful, Jess. Thank you very much. And I know you have to skedaddle to get to your next meeting in a few minutes' time. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us this morning. And if Jess disappears from your screen, it's not because she's had enough and she's just walked away. It's because she's rushing off to her next thing. So thank you very much to you, Jess. I'm going to come now, if I can, to Matt Persson from EY to see if we can sort of talk with a slightly different lens from sort of a big consultancy sort of context. What are you hearing from your clients at the moment about the end of the transition, and particularly the sort of future relationship? Jess has sort of done a half and half, there's things in the near term and then there's the longer term picture. I'd love to know what you're hearing from your clients about the sort of the far horizon and the future relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for having me. So yeah, I can just echo what both Matthew and Jess said, right, in terms of a lot of the focus is on the kind of the short-term operational side of things at the moment, and naturally, therefore, businesses have somewhat limited, bandwidth. Also thinking about fighting COVID and sort of the implication of all of that to have this big strategic internal powwows around what might happen next, but I just want to endorse everything that you said in terms of sort of the short-term thinking, or sort of the short-term focus at the moment for businesses. Moving beyond that, though, what I will say is there are a number of things you can say about the UK-EU relationship, but arguably one of the more interesting things that is developing with respect to the business that we are working with is really how sort of the new EU-UK relationship is docking with other structural changes that are happening in the economy and the business community, and quite a few of those will be policy-led as well. So if you think about the trade and commercial environment, the global trade and commercial environment, of course Brexit is a big part of that, right? But it's only one part of a huge number of moving parts and forces. So in wake of COVID, of course, there's a whole new discussion around medical supply chains, PPE supply chains, etc. So that's a quite big discussion. A lot of stuff flows from that. Not all of that I would say is positive. There's a bit of downside risk involved in that. But of course, there is also a new discussion taking place around where do we source? Is there going to be a restructuring or repatriation of supply chain? If so, which sectors will that take place in? Will my business potentially fall into a big strategic discussion around whether my supply chain needs to be effectively domestic, and if therefore are there risks and opportunities associated with that. So I think there's a very big discussion around trading, sort of international trade and commerce, of which Brexit is one part. But I think secondly, in terms of thinking again around how the EU-UK relationship is docking with wider structural changes and adjustments, particularly on things like net zero and the energy transition, I think there's some real interesting areas sort of opening up here. So, for example, I work a lot with automotive makers and automotive suppliers at the moment around the transition from from diesel and petrol engines into electric vehicles, for example. And there you have some real interesting strategic discussions around, you sort of have trade changing globally, including the relationship with the EU, where you start to see via, for example, rules of origin, which are really interesting in the TCA with respect to batteries, via, kind of some environmental policies that, for example, is driving more towards sustainable sourcing. You start to see almost like a regionalization or restructuring of supply chains. So if you think about the European battery economy, we are driving ourselves towards a situation, for better or worse, where you kind of need to start to source battery from within the EU's extended battery zone, including the UK via the TSA, and that can potentially lead to quite big footprint and manufacturing change, sort of location decision changes. And that's super interesting, right? Because that's where also the short-term tactical links or sort of docks with more medium-term strategic, because if you want to make changes in response to the EU-UK relationship around where you're sourcing decisions, you want to make sure that if you're an automotive maker or if you're a tier 1 supplier, that aligns with your transition into the battery economy. So you don't start to source from somewhere which won't also help you in 3 or 4 years' time when you need to move into different sourcing around batteries. So hopefully that's not too abstract, but that is a super interesting discussion where, to be honest, I think there actually are a lot of opportunities for UK businesses, particularly sort of in sectors where you have simultaneous policy-led transformation, including automotive and energy, for example.
Yeah, fascinating. And certainly sort of to think about it in terms of Brexit only is somewhat limiting, because it's true that it's huge deal Brexit, and it's fiddly and it's now and all of those things, but then perhaps we forget that there is a sort of much wider lens to think about. Matt, before I come to Sean, which I will do in a second, I did just want to ask you about this phrase that you coined, brovid. I mean, in my little world as a consumer, when I go into Sainsbury's and I find there's no fresh, veg or whatever, and I go in at the end of the day, I wonder to myself, is this a COVID thing or is this a Brexit thing? But obviously in the context of business, we've got these two sort of horrible twin sort of pressures, if you like. What's your sort of view on how those two things are sort of interplaying on one another for businesses at the moment?
Yeah, I'm not sure if
Hi Jess, thank you.
So as Jess hears the term brovid, she's understandably leaving, which I will do as well. But so I think this time brovid, I'm not sure if I can take credit or discredit, if that's the word for it. But I think clearly, we anticipated for some time that sort of Brexit and COVID would come together, and of course, you didn't necessarily need to be a super forecaster with respect to sort of see that one coming. But I do think that for me, the EU-UK sort of the new relationship and the sort of short-term friction, if you will, is primarily a supply side event. It's not necessarily that big of a demand event. COVID is a big demand event, right? It completely drives consumer behavior, partly because of the government mandated restrictions, which kind of is both changing behavior and accelerates trends. So to me, the big difference between the two is that one is supply side primarily, which is Brexit. The other one is both, but also a huge demand. So but I do think you need to plan for them both in parallel, and understand a little bit what is what, because you may want to mitigate against sources of friction a little bit differently depending on it's Brexit or depending on whether it's COVID. So COVID induced delay will be because of a factory shutdown or because 20% of the workforce have to be self-isolating. A Brexit induced delay will probably be more around getting the goods across the border. For one, you'll probably have the mitigating action on the kind of sourcing side, if you will, right, which is on the sort of the sourcing country. For the other one, you will have most of the mitigating action in the receiving country, because that is about the import stuff, which Jess talked about, which will now also come in. We'll start to see the actual full phasing in of that in April and June. So I think it is important to try to dissect a little bit which one is which, but it can be quite difficult to know. And as you can imagine, we're doing, certainly some of my colleagues are doing a huge amount of work on that. Sort of, we call it hypercare, right? You have this arrangement where you go in and you have a SWAT team almost moving in and try to solve bottlenecks, whether it's COVID or Brexit, and ideally try to sort of solve both in parallel, so you can also save some resource in the process. But I think it's the right question to ask. But I think the main thing is to remember is that, to me, COVID is, I'm stating the obvious, an infinitely bigger event because it impacts demand. The final thing to say on that, Liz, is that it is really interesting because, and I don't know if this makes people feel better or worse, but it is quite interesting to see how the two can work together. So we work with companies, for example, that in consumer products, for food products in particular, that because they had built up stock build, because they had stockpiled and increased inventory, anticipating Brexit, when the demand surge came via the big weekly shops, online shops often, because they had that stock build, they can quickly, they can sort of tap into the inventory that have been built because of responding to Brexit, and then take advantage of the surge in demand. So there are some interesting examples of where companies have, managed to grab 12% market share in a matter of a few weeks, because they just had a better equipped supply chain because of Brexit than responding to demand changes because of COVID. So there are some quite neat examples of that. If you do that well, it's not always easy to do, but if you do that well, then you can actually get a bit of a competitive advantage potentially.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, Matt. It's fascinating. I think this notion of trying to unravel or disentangle what is a COVID thing and what is a Brexit thing for your business to sort of help your scenario planning and your outlook is really key. And I think Alice will look to sort of post some links to some of those helplines and things that Jess was talking about that are available, particularly for SMEs if you're struggling and you need a bit of help to sort of navigate your way through with your specific pressures. I'm going to come to Sean, who's waited very patiently as we've worked our way through this morning. Sean Maguire, you're the European Director for the CBI, and so super close to all of this stuff. Are you in Brussels at the moment?
I am, yes.
So talk to us about Article 16. This is all very exciting at the weekend. It all kind of kicked off a little bit. And I just wonder how, I sound like a journalist, how the Article 16 row, I mean, it sort of was a row. How do you think that could affect UK-EU relations sort of over the next, I suppose, short and medium term?
Thank you, Liz, and good morning, everyone. Well, I think the starting point is to remember why the protocol is there. It is there for peace, prosperity and security on the island of Ireland, and both sides were committed to this through the negotiations. It was a shared objective, and an agreement was reached, and now it's about implementing the terms and conditions of that protocol. I think what the weekend's events show is that decisions rushed or panicked decisions without adequate consultation of both parties, but also internally within the EU, can lead to mistakes. And this was a big mistake. And there has been acknowledgement from the President of the Commission that it was a mistake, and therefore we should move on. It is reassuring that once the EU recognised its mistake, it retracted immediately and backtracked on the decision of triggering Article 16. But it was an unsettling weekend for many, and indeed tensions are high. And as we've seen over this past couple of days, the tensions are still there with the suspension of border control at certain ports in Northern Ireland. I think there's also lessons to be learned that this is a highly emotive debate, and not everyone understands the intricacies, even on the EU side, of what the protocol means for Northern Ireland. So I think lessons have been learned on both sides. It's good that when challenges arise going forward, it's that both sides sit down and look at these issues in a pragmatic and constructive way, work together to resolve the difficulties, and by doing so, eliminating some of the tensions that could arise. And I think that is the important aspect. Going forward, we're pleased to see that the dialogue between Michael Gove and Vice President Šefčovič will take place. There's important that it's a reset moment, and hopefully that even though in the short term the damage may be done, we can use this opportunity to really iron out the outstanding issues that need to be addressed in the protocol.
Is it your sense that the mood music, if you like, it's a sort of horrible phrase, but you know what I mean, the sort of vibe in Brussels, how is it now? Do you think it's materially changed because of the weekend? I mean, maybe how was it up to then?
I think we need to put this all in context as well. This was a big issue in UK, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Brussels bubble. It probably didn't get fully exposed throughout the rest of Europe, because like many nations, they're dealing with COVID and reactions to the current pandemic, vaccinations, and actually this was much more about a vaccination row in Europe rather than a Brexit one. So I think a lot of this would have been picked up in other capitals as a export control or a knee-jerk reaction from the EU on how to make sure that it gets the right amount of vaccines, it vaccinates its people, rather than a Brexit Northern Ireland issue. So while we live in the storm, it doesn't always emanate from the kind of epicenter of Brussels, London, Belfast, Dublin. And I think that's important to remember. But certainly in this time with MEPs and with the Commission, the spotlight is on them. Do not rush into these decisions again, that we need to take these emergency phone calls on a Friday evening, that the media run away with it. So I think that's the lesson. Has it damaged the relations? No, but it has certainly not strengthened them after, just 31 days.
Yeah, I guess to an extent it's sort of understandable. I mean, something like this was almost bound to happen at some point, and when you think about all the sort of the pressures, to a degree it's understandable. And as you say, they acknowledged it was a mistake. They very quickly sort of unraveled it, and that in a way, if we can take a step back and look at it in that way as you described, Sean, that should be encouraging, not discouraging. But that was the way it played out. I wonder if you might tell us a bit more about the UK's our role in the B7, really. What's that looking like now, and how it's evolving?
Well, I think it's picking up very much what Jess had said, what Matt had said. There are opportunities, and also there's, it's not all about Brexit and the UK-EU relationship. And 2021 is an important year for the UK. It holds the presidency of the G7. It co-hosts COP26 with the Italians. And the CBI and our members are fully supportive of the government's attention to make these events a success. We want to demonstrate that the UK is open for business, it's committed to playing an international role, and showcase business and indeed political leadership in addressing global economic and societal challenges, whether it's climate, whether it's inequality, whether it's diversity or inclusion. So I think there's a real opportunity here. I think the G20 and the G7 processes have suffered a little bit over this past few years, and this is an opportunity to reset the button and to have a legacy that this isn't just a one-year event, but actually set a kind of trajectory for future global cooperation on a lot of these issues. Of course, both events will be held against the backdrop of the ongoing health crisis, and the economic recovery will be front and center, but also the health agenda will be very, very important, and the role that business can play in that as well. And it's important to remember that no domestic recovery will be sustainable unless there's a global recovery, and I think this is where we can play. So from a CBI perspective, we will hold the presidency of the B7, which is the bringing together of the business federations from the G7 nations. Through the B7, we hope to galvanize, business action on climate change, on sustainability, on trade, digital, and re-establishing the UK's reputation as a global leader engaged in the international screen. Because I think people think with Brexit, etc., that we're retrenching back, but actually it's the complete opposite. It's going outwards. We will do a number of events. We plan to have a B7 declaration ahead of the G7 summit in June with our kind of counterparts in the B7 countries on climate, on trade, and on digital, and how business can actually help in the political arena to deliver some of these global objectives.
Thanks, Sean. I mean, the sort of public health outlook, with of course the energy, sustainability, climate outlook, would seem to me to be the two really, really big sort of almost motivating factors, and then all the other stuff, she says casually, like trade, like all of, those are the things that knit those things together. I wanted that I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here because it wasn't in a brief at all, but if you think about COP26, how optimistic are you for the outcome of what will actually happen in Glasgow at this point, knowing everything that's going on about climate? You've got Brexit and you've got COVID, and then there's this sort of other lurking thing over there, which is called climate change. What's your sense of where we're going with that?
I think with the election of President Biden, it can help with the narrative going forward. But we shouldn't underestimate that when we bring together over 100 countries trying to get, a Glasgow Accord like we got in Paris, that may not be achievable because different economies are in a different place with regard to COVID. Their priority of green and the climate agenda is at different levels. So I think from a political point of view, it may not be that kind of Paris Accord defining moment. But where real success comes forward is where we as the business communities can demonstrate that actually we're moving much faster than the political environment, and that business is delivering on a climate agenda. We're committed to the net zero ambition by 2050, and that in order to help facilitate this, we need a framework from global governments to accelerate it, and finance plays an important part of that. So I think success will be that it's not just end of November and we forget about it, but that business is the trend that takes it forward.
Interesting.
Thanks very much. To jump in and build on that, if I may. I think Sean's absolutely right. Both the sort of G7 and then COP later in the year offer a real opportunity actually for the UK to show some leadership on major issues. And actually, what we've seen in the last few years is quite a bit of fragmentation going on around the world. We haven't had that major international coordinated effort to tackle some of the major issues of the day, such as response to COVID and the economic recovery, such as our approach to net zero and so on. If we can bring that back together and the UK can play a leading role in doing that, I think that will be really helpful. And then particularly on your question around COP and net zero, I think there is something in a sort of tipping point moment, and actually it's being driven by rapidly rising consumer expectations. And businesses now engaged in a race to the top almost to get on the front foot on this agenda. And exactly as Sean says, there can be leadership from the international business community, and then all governments actually get on board with that as well.
Yeah, certainly there's it's all to play for, isn't it? I guess I think that's the thing I wanted to sort of make sure we did this morning. There's lots of near-term, really challenging, and as I said before, fiddly things that are facing businesses to sort of get through the transition period plays out, and obviously dealing with COVID. But I just don't. We can't afford to lose track of that sort of longer term horizon. It's been completely fascinating. I know Alice and the CBI team have been working way behind the scenes to share with everybody who's watching easy links to access some of those help and advice support facilities that Jess was talking about before she went. And we've sort of run out of road. So as they gather that stuff together, I'm sure that there's a way that they'll be able to get them out to everybody. So if you want to do an hour consultation, or if you want some advice and help and things like that, we'll make sure that comes through to you. But for now, I just want to say a really big thank you to Jess in her absence, to Sean, Matt, and of course to Matthew for joining us this morning. I know there was a lot of information in there, but I do hope it was useful, and we will see you, well, James and the team will see you on Monday, and I'll be back again a week today. So have a really good rest of the day. As I always say, go and have a cup of tea, take 10 minutes before you check your emails, and we will see you again shortly. Thank you very much. Bye bye.